Alberta Primetime with Michael Higgins.
Welcome to Alberta Primetime. Ahead tonight, our politics panel on a clash of perspectives at the Western Premiers Conference. But first, weighing the impact of a referendum.
It's no surprise to me that I've been already hearing from people who are questioning whether they should continue to invest in Alberta.
Even having this conversation has been incredibly damaging to the prospects of investing here in Calgary and Alberta.
A reaction from Alberta's big city mayors to the Smith government advancing a question on separation to the October 19th referendum, fearing it could fuel economic uncertainty for years to come. Joining us now, Deborah Yedlin, President and CEO of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. Ms. Yedlin, good to see you. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
All right. You've told us previously about concern over separation dialogue. So what degree of impact do you see coming with the introduction now of an actual referendum question?
Well, I think all of a sudden people realize that this is not something in the abstract that could move forward. It is moving forward with a confusing question. But it's interesting to see how we've already seen the launch of a couple of initiatives other than Thomas Lukaszik's one with Monty Solberg, former MP, and Jason Kenney, former Premier, as well as another initiative that involves both two former finance ministers, Jim Dinning and Travis Taves. So clearly there is concern about the uncertainty that this casts. And I think the biggest thing to remember is we are already dealing with the biggest trade shock as a result of what the U.S. wants to do, on top of a war in the Middle East that is, playing havoc with energy prices. And we don't need anything else to add to the uncertainty pile. But this is exactly what's taking place with this decision to go ahead with the referendum. And we're just making our own weather that we just really don't need to do.
Why would this be such an inflection point? What is it about the question that makes it so destabilizing now?
Well, I think we have to look at a couple of examples. Obviously, one is Brexit, where there was a sense that if the UK separated from the EU, it would have more money, that it would be better for economic growth. Neither have been proven to be the case. Foreign investment fell by almost 18% in the UK, as well as the economy decreasing in terms of, I think, at the 6 to 8% rather than the 3 or 4% that was advertised. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we look to the Quebec conversation. For 2 years running up to the Quebec referendum, the Quebec government could not sell provincial bonds because of the uncertainty associated with the looming referendum. We know that prior to that, under when René Lévesque was in power, companies left, 700 companies left Quebec. There's a reason why. The Bank of Montreal is headquartered in Toronto. And, upwards of 40,000 people left in 1 year. So even the prospect of the uncertainty causes people to leave. That compromises investment. It compromises economic growth. It compromises productivity. And, and to what end?
We heard big city mayors there a moment ago reflecting on impact already showing itself. What is it you are hearing?
Well, we're hearing that in some cases people have said, well, I was going to invest more in Calgary. I was going to invest more in Alberta. I'm just going to wait and see what happens before I make any commitments. And people, from a business standpoint, we're hearing a lot of conversations behind the scenes about the concern that this represents for businesses, broadly speaking. I think when we look at it in a broader context, we are 2 to 3% of the global capital markets. Our industries over the decades have grown by attracting foreign investment. That has dried up partly because of the challenging regulatory environment, but also because we had a very low pricing environment in the energy space for a while, up until about 2020, and when prices did start to recover. And so we need to make sure that we are presenting ourselves as a stable jurisdiction for investment. Capital goes to where it gets the best return. And if there's another place that has a lower risk premium to it, then perhaps that's where the capital is going to go. We don't need to add to the uncertainty pile that already exists.
Your members heard from Alberta's Environment Minister on Tuesday. Grant Hunter, I believe, told you he isn't worried about the referendum having an impact on efforts to secure a new pipeline to the coast. What do you make of the government's confidence in that regard?
Well, yeah, I think they're looking at the numbers that the polling folks have been releasing, saying that sort of 30% wants to leave, and that's pretty stable. The concern is there are people who still believe that we need to send a message to Ottawa. And my response to that is we have a different government in Ottawa. The old government's gone. Stephen Guilbeault resigned today. Hallelujah. And we are moving forward with an MOU, with a pipeline. What we need is the certainty for investment to fill that pipeline. So let's get there. But if you have something hanging over from an uncertainty perspective, there's going to be times on the sidelines waiting to see what you can do going forward.
Flip side of the coin, has anyone presented to the Calgary Chamber a credible argument for how or why independence would put Alberta's business community in a better position?
No, and I think it's really important to realize that a lot of the things that are being put forward don't really hold the economic water that some of the people that are putting those statements forward actually hold. It is a completely unworkable solution from the perspective of we have interprovincial trade issues. And if you're a country that is sort of faced with two other provinces on either side, it's not going to be easy to negotiate your access, and as a province, you have to provide all the services that you get from the federal government already. This is not something that results in increased prosperity for Albertans. And anybody who's trying to tell them that that's the case is lying.
As you mentioned earlier, a number of pro-Canada campaigns already emerging. How do you see the business community responding to that? Is that something business leaders will actively engage in?
I think as we see now that the question's been tabled and there's organizations that are coming together to push back, we will see more of a voice from the business community. I think it's also instructive that even though we talk about the potential for a referendum happening in Quebec as a result of the election in the fall, the business community in Quebec is dead set against another referendum for the reasons that they have, because of the experience that they had in Quebec following the two referenda that were held. So they know what the damage looks like. They don't want to go back there again. And so I think that's something we all have to pay attention to. Whether it's the Chamber of Commerce, it's business, it's everybody. This is not something we need as a country or as a province. And even as there are issues that people feel need to be aired, those issues do not warrant the breakup of a country.
Okay, one final question for you. I know you also hosted the Premier on the same day ahead of the address that was delivered on television. I don't know if you passed a message along then, but what is the message that you're sending to the Smith government now that this question is out? Is it that you don't want the referendum, period?
In the best of all possible worlds, yes. This is not something that is constructive. It is going to consume a lot of energy and time between now and October at a time when we really need to think about getting back to basics. Let's make sure that we're meeting the needs of Albertans. Let's make sure that the government is acting in a way that supports the needs, whether it's healthcare, education, social services. We need to get back to basics. This is not something that is really helpful in there's no way you can cast this as being a helpful initiative. In the best of all possibility worlds, it disappears. Whether that's realistic or not, I don't know. But we really need to see Alberta stay in the country.
All right. We'll leave it there. As always, appreciate your time, Ms. Yedlin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Deborah Yedlin is President and CEO of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. From Western Premier's Conference fallout to the business community weighing in on the impact of a referendum on separation, and Stephen Guilbeault signaling his departure. Time now for tonight's politics panel. And joining us this evening, Brendan Boyd, Associate Professor of Political Science at MacEwan University, and Rob Breckenridge is a writer, broadcaster, Calgary Herald columnist. Good evening to you both. And let's begin with some uncomfortable discussions closing out the Western Premiers Conference in Kananaskis on the referendum, and friction over an Alberta court throwing out a separation petition due to the failure of the province to consult with First Nations.
We want to make sure that we have a very clear understanding of what the duty to consult really means and what it doesn't mean, and I think at the moment there's a lack of clarity on that.
It is not up to the petition gatherers to fulfill the duty to consult. It is up to you as the Alberta government to fulfill the duty to consult. Why don't we hold off on this referendum talk for a year or two and see if we get these pipelines under construction?
And while there was also contention from BC Premier David Eby over both the separation referendum and perspective on a new pipeline, there was also an effort to create a unified front on setting Canada on a path to economic certainty. Brendan, it's probably safe to assume that there might be difficult, strained discussions behind closed doors out of the eye of cameras, but what does it signal when friction captivates the closing news conference?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things to remember is that there are lots of things that the premiers agree on. They discuss a number of different issues, and maybe they're smaller things or less controversial things. And so both things can be true in the sense that they might agree and get along well when talking about some issues. But then when they deal with things like, say, Alberta separatism and pipelines, that is something that maybe gets more contentious. And I think, the discussion between Alberta and BC is not new. We've had those discussions over the previous pipelines. What is new, I think, though, is that Wab Kinew, the Premier of Manitoba, represents, a more direct and more, I think, authentic voice in terms of Indigenous people in these relations. And a lot of times there has been recognition or sort of consternation from Indigenous nations and leaders that they've been left out of these intergovernmental discussions. And I think to a certain extent, he speaks with more authenticity to represent those views. And I think that's a new dynamic that we haven't seen before in intergovernmental relations.
Rob, how much of a window might comments from Premiers Kinew and Eby open on how the rest of the country is looking in on Alberta's internal conversation on a referendum over separation?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, this is something that's obviously attracting national attention and interest, and the reasons for that are pretty clear. Like, we're talking about a situation that threatens Confederation, threatens national unity. So, of course, there's going to be an interest on the part of all Canadians. The delicate balance, I guess, in all of this is, voicing those concerns, or at least voicing support for a Confederation, and not inflaming the situation in Alberta. And I think we've seen, in the past where maybe some of these comments or interventions have kind of fallen on the latter side of that. David Eby has been somewhat provocative in some of the things he has had to say about Alberta. But, I mean, look, Alberta's not above criticism. The Premier's not above criticism. So I think it's fair to have an opinion on all of this. I do think overall the tone out of this meeting and what we heard in the press conference, a couple of exchanges aside, was a lot of consensus on the value of working together and moving forward, and the change in approach and the different messaging and openness they're receiving from the federal government. So I think there were some positives, but yeah, some of that underlying tension was pretty clear too.
Brendan, blowback from provincial counterparts. Is this something Premier Smith can simply move on from, or do you see potential consequences resulting from the premiers of Manitoba and BC pushing back?
I mean, ultimately, she's accountable to the voters of Alberta, and she has to get along to a certain extent with premiers and other officials, from outside the country, but outside the province. But ultimately, I think, this kind of stuff blows over. When they meet, we hear about it. And sometimes if there's a war of words. But, if you think about when Rachel Notley put in the ban of BC wines over their BC's opposition to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that didn't last very long. It was, kind of saber rattling. And so that's kind of what I see a lot of this as. And usually premiers will have, awareness that they're playing to their domestic base, their provincial base, and they're those supporters in their mind, I think, at the same time. That's probably the more important thing.
All right. Now, also on the referendum front, we heard from Deborah Yedlin off the top, the president of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, bringing business community perspective on concern over economic uncertainty, damage being brought on by the separation question. Rob, how do you see the Alberta government absorbing reaction like this? What kind of weight do you see the business community perspective carrying?
Well, I think you've already heard the Premier frame it this way, that she's fighting, for a united Canada, that, she's sort of beholden to the wishes of the people and these various petitions. And so that's what's brought us to this point. So it's sort of deflecting some of the blame a little bit here, but trying to argue that she wants to be a part of the solution. So I think that's how she's addressing it and saying she understands and hears those concerns, which is also why she says she's trying to fight for a better deal and fight for some of these projects. I mean, kind of the common thread between all of this so far is, around the duty to consult. I think from an economic and business perspective, if we want to be able to move forward on these major projects, especially a new pipeline, I think it's incumbent on the Alberta government to demonstrate an understanding and respect of the duty to consult and the importance of engaging with First Nations. Now, maybe there are some lingering issues to be cleared up around this petition and this court decision, but I think it's important for the Premier to recognize not just the constitutional obligation, but even the potential economic and business fallout from being a little too cavalier or dismissive of some of those issues. So I think that becomes part of the conversation too. But yeah, we can't ignore these risks that come with this uncertainty, and I think Deborah Yedlin laid that out very well.
Brendan, how big of a role do you see the business community, especially in the two big cities, playing in these remaining months ahead of the referendum question on separation?
Well, I mean, I think there'll be some. The organizations themselves obviously will be advocating and making the statements and arguments that they to promote business and economics. I think the big thing here is that there are a lot of voters, obviously, or a lot of people that are interested in separatism. Part of that is driven by economics, right? The federal regulatory decisions have had an impact, and they're upset about that. Now there needs to be this question of what are the impacts of sending a message to Ottawa through a referendum? Like as Ms. Yedlin said, this has now become real. And so what are those costs going to be? And do those costs outweigh the potential, or are they worse than the cost of having federal regulations and being part of Canada? Because there is a point at which this becomes cutting off your nose to spite your face, in the sense of, if we're doing economic damage to send a message to Ottawa about economic damage, well, that's, I think, a problem.
All right. Time for us to take a bit of a break. But when we come back, the impact of Stephen Guilbeault's impending departure from federal politics. More from our panel in a moment. Welcome back. Stephen Guilbeault confirmed his impending departure today from federal politics, and the Prime Minister had this to say of the former Environment and Climate Change Minister.
A dedicated MP for Ville Sainte-Marie for these years, for the people of Canada, for the government, for the cabinet, for myself and his vice. We've worked together. We worked together when I was UN Special Representative on climate action and finance as well. So we worked together closely in a variety of areas, and I've always enjoyed working with him.
Stephen Guilbeault says he will stay on until the summer, and in a statement posted to social media said it is time to move on. Now, Guilbeault had previously resigned from the Carney cabinet over the government's pipeline MOU with Alberta and its impact on climate policies originating with the Trudeau era. Brendan, is this Stephen Guilbeault reading the room?
Well, I mean, I think, he has a history of being a very dedicated climate activist from his sort of origins, and then obviously was under Trudeau, was environment minister and led a lot of the climate action stuff. So it's not a surprise that I think that he would not align with some of the things that the Carney government is doing in terms of rolling back some of those things, talking about those regulations, Trudeau-era regulations, and talking about a pipeline. So, I don't think this is particularly surprising to anyone, and I think I think he's someone that probably would act and has shown moral conviction, and so that would play a big role in that decision. I'm speculating a little bit, but it's not surprising anyways.
Rob, how much of a sign might this be that there may no longer be room for voices like Stephen Guilbeault's in the Carney government caucus?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. But, I mean, it does raise that possibility. But obviously, Mark Carney's taking a different approach and has a different kind of agenda than Justin Trudeau. And I think in a way, it almost lays it out for Liberals. Like, this is where things are going now. You can either be a part of it or you can take the Stephen Guilbeault route here. It is interesting because, look, Stephen Guilbeault is a very polarizing figure. And I think a lot of ways, certainly from an Alberta perspective, he's come to almost symbolize the approach of the last 10 years. Or it was climate policy above all else, little regard or concern for Alberta's interests or Alberta's worries about some of these other issues. And so I think that's part of what's built up some of this sentiment in Alberta. I don't know if things would have been that much different if he hadn't been in politics. I think Justin Trudeau did see this as a potential legacy issue for him, sort of the defining progressive issue of his era. But he does symbolize that in a lot of ways. I think the fact that he has voiced concern over the MOU, the fact that he is bowing out of politics, I think further sends a message in a positive way, I think, from Alberta's perspective, that this MOU is real, that it's not just words on paper, that this is a real change in direction. It's not just rhetoric. And I'll say this in defense of Stephen Guilbeault. I mean, he could have really kicked the hornet's nest and stirred up a lot of concern in the coming months about the debate here in Alberta. But he's sort of taken almost in a way the high road. He's bowing out, and I guess we'll see what the next few months brings, but it doesn't seem as though he's inclined to want to inflame the situation here any further.
Brendan, to pick up on some of Rob's points there, and we also heard Deborah Yedlin express her, I don't know, joy at word of the departure of Stephen Guilbeault. So welcome news politically here in Alberta. What's your read on the message, Brendan, that this is likely to send to leadership in our province?
Yeah, I mean, I would caution people to get too caught up in the personalities of one individual, right? There obviously is a lot gets attached because they're the figureheads of a particular issue or a particular department, that type of thing. So yeah, there will be a lot of people that are like Ms. Yedlin that will kind of say, okay, well, this is a step in the right direction, and we're getting the right people in the government. But the sentiment for climate action is not going to leave the Liberal caucus. We had the 14 MPs that sent a letter to Carney to indicate that they were concerned about the direction, right? And the Liberal Party has always had that sort of more fiscal economic wing that can take over. And then they also have the more sort of socially progressive side. And they've been able to manage that within the party. And, if you look back through history, there's always a shift back and forth. That's why they've been so successful in being able to win government, even when, they weren't expected to. So, it's not going to go away. It'll have a renaissance at some point, and it'll come back. It may not be for a little while. So, yeah, I don't think it means a greater long-term shift in terms of the Liberal Party. Like, those environmental sentiments will still be there, maybe not at the forefront, but still within the party for sure.
Rob, maybe 30 seconds for you. Guilbeault, not alone. Former cabinet minister Jonathan Wilkinson, also leaving elected life this summer. Toronto Liberal Nate Erskine-Smith, expected to resign too. At what point should the PM be worried about his slim majority?
Well, he should be worried. I mean, for now, he's basically going to lose that because those will be vacant seats. And some of these by-elections aren't as much of a slam dunk as at least a couple of the ones recently. So it's an interesting dynamic moving forward. And remember, the Liberals just took over all of the committees based on the argument that they had a majority. So it does make for some interesting dynamics in Parliament here moving forward.
All right. Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Good to see you both. Thank you for this.
Thanks, Michael.